Welcome to Medieval India. Episode 11, Malabar and the Portuguese. The whole of the southwestern coast of India, from Goa to Ceylon, was outside the Tughlaq Empire and only at times vaguely tributary to Vijayanagar. It consisted of a number of small principalities, all were Hindu. The Kannada coast was absorbed by Vijayanagar and then by the Nayakas of Ikari. But the region to the south of Kannur, Kerala and its central part Malabar was to remain independent up to the 1780s. And it so much differed from the rest of the subcontinent as to form virtually a world apart. A world which in some ways indeed resembles the Indonesian archipelago and Bali in particular more closely than it does Hindustan. This is likely the reason why Kerala is almost habitually omitted in general accounts of Indian history. The three most important kingdoms were from north to south the Kolatiri Raja of Kannur, the Samurin or Samudri Raja of Calicut, Kozhikode, and the Perumal of Travancore. The latter was likely always the most important prince, but the Travancore policy was more oriented towards its Tamil neighbours than the other policies in Kerala, and the founder of the Travancore kingdom, Ravi Varma, had indeed had himself crowned at Kanchivaram in the Tamil country, and he had fought Malik Kafur when Alauddin had sent him to the south, as we saw in episode 5. Only those kings could coin money and wear the royal umbrella over their head. Under them were a myriad bigger lords, the Rajas of Tanur, of Kranganur, of Cochin, of Mankati, of Idapali, of Vadakumkur, of Purakat, of Kayakulam, and of Kailan. But the real power in the land was held by the Kaimals, like the Iruvanda Nayar in Kannur, the Kavapalam Nayar and the Koratari Kaimal in the Samarin's territory, and many other lords, and the Anshi Kayamal in Cochin. The title Kaimal is derived from Kai, hand, signifying sovereignty or power. Some Kayamals were also in charge of the royal treasury, which, according to custom, could not be seen even by the kings except in their presence. Neither could they take anything out of the treasury without the greatest necessity, and by the counsel of this person and certain others. They were self-constituted justices of the peace and settled all ordinary disputes wherever they dwelt. Every Kayamal had his Charnavar, or adherents. The Puratu Charna were the outside adherents, the fighters, and the Akatu Charna were the inside adherents, clerks and domestics. The clan from which the former were drawn was superior to the latter. The Uralis were said to be masons, the Palichans bearers. Altogether, it amounted to some 200 smaller and bigger sovereignties, including, as said, the small Muslim principality of Aziraja that ruled the Bazaar of Kannur and the Lakadiv Islands to the north of the Maldives. For although the three great kingdoms incessantly fought one another, Kerala maintained the old Samanta system of late classical India. Much like in many other respects too, it was more archaic than the rest of the subcontinent. As the 16th century chronicle of the Muslims in Kerala, written by Sainuddin, Tuhfat al-Mujahideen put it, quote, "Whenever the Samarin commenced hostilities with any of the considerable chiefs of Malabar, After subduing them, it was his custom to restore them to their possessions, and the restitution, after some time might have elapsed, was always made." End quote. The suzerain could not interfere in the internal affairs of the Caimals, and he could not stop them either to go to war with one another. Any such interference would have been deemed oppression, allowing the Caimals to forsake their overlord. They had then regularly to pay homage to their overlord and were supposed to assist their overlord with a stipulated number of Nayar troopers if summoned to, but many again were immune from that too. And some too could decide on their own whom they could support in case of conflicts. There was a good deal of fighting between those kings, but that generally caused few or no casualties, and the aim for the warriors was primarily to display their prowess in sword fighting. For Kerala has long been renowned as the center of martial arts in India. Each Nayar had to go through a lengthy period of apprenticeship in those martial arts in a kala or gymnasium, and in every village there was an instructor in the martial arts who had great prestige. With all that, the territorial arrangements virtually did not change from the 15th into the 18th century. It produced an almost stable system where the smaller and the bigger kings carefully balanced each other out. Ibn Battuta gave an account of some of these states when he visited Kerala on his way to China in 1444, where he was going to go as an ambassador of Muhammad Tughlaq, and he was only too glad to have escaped from his claws. However, his ship was wrecked halfway, and after an unclear conflict with the Zamorin, he finally landed up in the Maldives. Ibn Battuta boarded a sailing vessel at Kandar near the mouth of the Narmada, and after passing through a few other harbours, he reached Sandapur, that is modern Goa. It was an island surrounded by a creek, in the midst of which were 36 villages and 2 cities, namely the old one, built by the old Hindu rulers, the Kadambas, and the new city built by the Muslims when they first had conquered it. Passing through a small island, probably Anjadivi, Ibn Battuta then reached Hinaur, probably modern Honavar, inhabited by Muslims who were, he said, powerful at sea and earned their living by maritime trade. The ruler was a Muslim, Jamal-ud-Din Muhammad, but he acknowledged the sovereignty of a Hindu king, probably the Hoysala one. Though Ibn Battuta speaks in a general way about the coast of Malabar as extending from Goa to Kailan, it appears from his description that Malabar proper was only reached 3 days after he left Hinaur. Ibn Battuta found that, quote, "In this country of Malabar there are 12 kings, the greatest of whom has 50,000 troops at his command, the least 5,000 or thereabout. That which separates the district of one king from that of another is a wooden gate, upon which is written, 'The gate of safety of anyone.' For when any criminal escapes from the district of one king and gets safely into that of another, he is safe, so that no one has the least desire to take him so long as he remains there." End quote. Most of those rulers then were, as was the case later on too, of the warrior caste, the Nayars, as follows from Ibn Battuta's statement that, quote, "The rulers in this land bequeath their sovereignty to the sons of their sisters and exclude their own children." The Nayars are a caste quite apart and unique in India, both by this matrilineal system of kingship as by the polyandry. As recorded in Ellis's edition of the Cabral, written in the High Victorian Age, quote, in Malabar, as is well known, the vision of Plato of the ideal republic is completely realized. The women among the Nayars not being restricted to family or number, but after she has been consecrated by the usual rites before the nuptial fire, in which ceremony any indifferent person may officiate as the representative of her husband, being in the intercourse with the other sex only restrained by her inclinations, provided that the male with whom she associates be of an equal or superior tribe. But it must be stated, for the glory of the female character, that notwithstanding the latitudes thus given to the Nayars, and that they are thus left to the guidance of their own free will and the play of their own fancy, which in other countries has not always been found the most efficient check on the conduct of the other sex, it rarely happens that they cohabit with more than one person at the same time. End quote. The Portuguese already marveled at this female polyandry in the 16th century. However, though the rulers were largely Nayars, there were extensive temple estates too, which were completely outside of the jurisdiction of the king, as were particularly distinguished Nambutri Brahmin communities, while the Nambutris were among the largest landholders too, and inherited their estates by their system of primogeniture, that is, that all possessions go to the eldest son intact. Even the Sri Padmanabha temple at Trivandrum, in the capital of Travancore, and one particularly favoured by the kings of Travancore, the temple was ruled by a committee of 9 Brahmins, where the king counted only for 4 votes. Although the rulers were Hindus, there was a strong Muslim presence in most of the states too. Tradition says that in the 9th century of the Christian era, a party of Muslim pilgrims, on their way to a sacred shrine in Ceylon, chanced to visit the capital of Chiroman Perumal, or the first king of Malabar. That they were most hospitably entertained by their prince, and that he, becoming a convert to their faith, subsequently accompanied them to Mecca, where he died. It is further reputed in their tradition that the Perumal, becoming anxious of establishing his new faith in Malabar with suitable places of worship, had sent his followers with letters to all the chieftains whom he had appointed in his stead, and required them to give land for mosques and to endow them richly. The Perumal's instructions were carried out, and 9 mosques were founded and endowed in various parts of Malabar. Whatever truth there may be in these accounts, it is certain that as early as the 8th century, the Arabs had settled for commercial purposes on the Malabar coast, that they had contracted alliances with women of the country, and that the mixed group thus formed had begun to be known as the Mappilas. Though they usually lived apart from the Hindus, they received very fair and liberal treatment, and they enjoyed perfect freedom of worship. At Varganar, a place in South Kannada, the 30 warships of the Raja were in charge of a Muslim commander, according to Ibn Battuta. The ruler of Jorfatan, which has been identified with Kannur, possessed many ships which went to Oman, Fars and Yemen. These were the ancestors of the Aziraja, who was to become a constant thorn in the flesh of the Portuguese in the 16th century. After a brief halt at Kozhikode, Calicut, to which we shall turn in a moment, Ibn Battuta proceeded by the backwaters to Ceylan. On his way he passed by a Jewish settlement at Kunjakari that was under its own Jewish chief, but was paying tax to the Hindu ruler of Ceylan. But the largest Jewish community lived in Kochi, where their religion was officially permitted since the 10th century by a copper plate dating from that time. This Hindu Raja too held the Muslims in high regard, and they had a prosperous settlement under their own chief and judge, both of whom hailed from Persia. The date of Cheruman Perumal is not definitely known, but most probably he flourished between the years 750 and 1825. The end of the rule of the Perumals then gave rise to a number of small principalities in Malabar, the most important of which was Calicut. Many traditions are current tracing the line of the rulers of Calicut, who were called the Zamorin, which means the sovereign ruler, in an unbroken line of succession from Mana Vikraman, son of Cheruman Perumal and the Nayar Kul, belonging to the families of the Iradis of Nidiyupur. It is said that as this son could not succeed his father under the matriarchal system prevalent amongst the Nayars, Cheruman Perumal, at the time of his abdication, gave him as a special mark of regard and affection his sword and a small strip of territory on the coast, which later on became the port of Calicut. The riches derived from trade enabled the Zamorin to extend his authority along the Malabar coast from Kannur to Cochin. The Hindu ruler of Cochin traced his descent from the Suraya Kshatriya caste, to whom Cheruman Perumal is said to have given the country round Cochin when he divided his empire. Though they considered themselves superior to the Zamorin, as being Kshatriyas, while the Zamorin was a Nayar, in the course of time the kingdom had been split up among 5 branches of the dynasty, who formed a sort of federation, the oldest male member among all the branches taking together having the right to succeed to the nominal headship. This naturally gave rise to all kinds of internal dissensions, full advantage of which was taken by the Zamorin of Calicut. By offering his help to one of the rival parties, he could easily establish his political influence in Cochin, and in this way he had conquered a large part of the region around Cochin and reduced the Raja to a state of vassalage. According to the historical chronicles of Kerala, quote, the Cochin Raja paid an annual tribute to his sovereign, Zamorin, obtained his overlord's recognition before his accession, sent contingents to the Zamorin's army, and refrained from striking coins and roofing his palace with tiles. He had to send all his pepper to Calicut, and the Christians were deprived of the right of navigation, which was transferred to the Muslims instead. End quote. This is corroborated by the Portuguese accounts, according to which the kingdom of Cochin, like Kannur, was subject to the Zamorin, who often drove the king out of his kingdom and restored him at his pleasure. Ibn Battuta visited the city of Calicut no less than 6 times and stayed there for nearly 3 months. He has left an account of its commercial importance. It was to him one of the chief harbours of the country of Malabar, where people from China, Java, Ceylon, the Maldive Islands, Yemen and Fars come and here gather merchants from all quarters of the globe, and the harbour of Calicut is one of the largest in the world. End quote. The trade and commerce were mainly in the hands of Muslims, mostly traders from Arab ports. Ibrahim, a merchant from Bahrain, was the head of the merchants in the town, and he held the office of Shah Bandar, or Receiver General of Duties. He was the chief officer in the custom house, with whom foreign merchants and captains negotiated. The judge of Calicut was also a Muslim. Another Muslim, the shipmaster Miskal, said Ibn Battuta, possessed great riches and sent many ships for trading purposes to India, China, Yemen and Fars. Thus, although the ruler was Hindu, the Muslims dominated not just the commerce but also the politics of the kingdom of Calicut. The king gave absolute freedom of worship to the Muslims, though he forbade the slaughter of cows and the eating of beef. The religious toleration, the good administration, which guaranteed security and impartiality of treatment to all, and above all the friendly attitude of the Zamorin to all foreign traders, were the causes that made Calicut in the course of the 14th century the chief center of trade of Malabar, taking over from Kulam, as the Tughvat underlined it in the mid-16th century, quote, "Be it understood that the Muslims of Malabar lived in great comfort and tranquillity in consequence of their refraining from exercising any oppression on the people as due to their consideration from the ancient customs of Malabar." End quote. But these very virtues of the Zamorin's rule proved his undoing on the advent of the Portuguese. It is here necessary to make a couple of preliminary observations about the maritime trade of India. The change in the foreign trade and maritime activities of India during the 16th century changed the course of history, not just that of India, but that of the entire world. Indians had carried on maritime trade since the age of the ancient Indus civilization, at least from 2300 before Christ on, both in the Arabian Seas and in the Bay of Bengal. The rise of the Arabs as a great maritime power in the 9th century, a Christian era, was the first direct challenge to that supremacy of the Indians in the Arabian Seas. The position in the 15th century can be summed up as follows. Indian-owned ships from Gujarat, Malabar and various ports on the eastern coast brought spices and other costly goods from Malacca, then practically the sole entrepot for China and the Spice Islands, and on the western part, Indian ships carried on trade with Hormuz in the Persian Gulf and various ports on the coast of East Africa, such as Kilwa, Malindi and Mombasa, and pilgrim traffic from India to the Red Sea. The main center of this trade was Gujarat, but Malabar and the Konkan also had a large share in it, as is proven by the detailed statement of Ibn Battuta. A few yonks from China still reached India, but most of them stopped at Malacca. Those yonks from China were strongly built, the timber being fastened by iron nails. The ships owned by the Indians and Arabs, including the Egyptians, were built mainly in India, as wood is clearly scarce on the coastline of the Red Sea or in the Persian Gulf. But they were very fragile, as their heavy planks were tied together with coconut cordage and wooden pins, partly because the protective coating with which the ships were coated did not adhere well to metal pins, partly because metal was expensive, and partly and obviously as iron rusts quickly in a damp tropical climate. But such flimsy ships could scantly carry, let alone fire, the heavy ordnance the Portuguese ships were equipped with. The Arabs monopolized the trade from Malabar to the Red Sea. The eastern goods brought by Indian ships to Malabar port, together with the Indian pepper and the cinnamon from Ceylon, were carried in Arab ships to Jeddah and Hormuz. They also shared with Indian ships the carrying trade between Gujarat and the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, East Africa, and occasionally Madagascar. From Hormuz, Indian wares were sent in smaller boats, more suited to those shallow waters, to Basra, and then by boat or caravan to Baghdad, where the trade routes divided. Some caravans started for Trebizond, Trabzon, and then on to Istanbul or on to the Crimea, but most went on to Aleppo. The goods were purchased by Phoenicians and Genoese for distribution over Europe there. Jeddah played a similar role in the Red Sea as Hormuz did in the Persian Gulf. To the north of Jeddah, navigation was hampered by reefs and shoals, and so goods were transferred to smaller boats that went on to Suez. From Suez, merchandise crossed the desert to Cairo on camels, and from there went down the Nile to Alexandria, that in this period was the main entrepot for trade between India and Europe, the trade being dominated by the famous Phoenician Galera de Mercanditia, the twice-yearly merchant galley convoys that were the grand trade of late medieval Europe. The Arabs were thus almost the sole purveyors of those eastern spices, which were so much prized in Europe that peperduur, prized as pepper, is still the normal Dutch way of saying something is very expensive. They controlled the entire trade between India and Europe, except the small volume that passed over the land routes from the northwest of India and then on through Astrakhan in southern Russia, or from the head of the Persian Gulf to the Crimea and then on to Lviv in the present Ukraine. But the Arabs were also mere intermediaries. The goods carried by them to the Mediterranean ports were then purchased by the Italian merchants, who distributed those goods throughout Europe. Where Venice had gradually elbowed out the Genoese and the Florentines, and by the late 14th century it had a virtual monopoly in the pepper trade. The cost of transmitting wares from India to Europe was very heavy, due to the large number of transshipment points and the high duties that were imposed by the various authorities through whose jurisdictions they had to pass. From Calicut to Cairo, for example, pepper increased 240% in price. Clearly, that monopoly of Venice in that profitable eastern trade was envied by other adventurous maritime nations, such as the Castilians, the Portuguese and the Catalans, who were a major maritime power in the Mediterranean and in North Africa at the time. The wonderful geographic discoveries by the Castilians and the Portuguese in the course of the 15th century induced the Pope, Alexander VI, to regulate the enterprise into the unknown world by dividing it between them in 1494 at celebrated Treaty of Tordesillas, where all territories west of a line 370 leagues beyond the Cape Verde Islands were declared Spanish and everything to the east of it was declared Portuguese. By that time, the Portuguese had not only explored the entire west coast of Africa, but Bartholomeus Diaz had proceeded up to the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. After the return of Diaz, there was a royal council in which some of the councillors thought that, quote, India had better not be discovered. But King Manuel still opted that opening an all-sea route would enable the Portuguese to import goods from India at a much cheaper cost, and by one stroke it would transfer to the Portuguese not only the huge wealth hitherto flowing to Venice, but more importantly, it would eliminate the Muslim middlemen with whom the Europeans had so far to deal, the Fatimid dynasty of Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. Thus it was that Vasco da Gama, a junior nobleman from the small town of Sines, who was selected for the task as being single, was chosen by King Manuel to find a direct route to India from Portugal via the Cape of Good Hope and establish diplomatic and trading contacts with Indian rulers. On July 8, 1497, he left Lisbon with 4 vessels of a tonnage varying from 60 to 150 tons on this perilous undertaking. At the 17th of May 1498, the inhabitants of the small village of Capucat, 8 miles to the north of Calicut, saw the strange spectacle of these 4 sailing vessels at anchor, which were manned by white-skinned people that were not known to them. The rural folk were amused, perhaps a little bewildered, but little did they dream that those men were the harbingers of world historic changes. The next day, the ships sent 3 men ashore who were met by 2 Muslim merchants. One of them hailed from Tunis, and he said to them in the Catalan language, "May the devil take you! What brought you here?" To which the Portuguese answered, "We have come to search for Christians and spices." Those were the vessels which, under the leadership of Vasco da Gama, by a mere accident had touched the land at a point lying within the kingdom of the Zamorin of Calicut. Da Gama's Arab pilot, which he had taken in at the East African port of Malindi, may have preferred not to head for Gujarat, for this principality was ruled by the Muslims, the sworn enemy of the Portuguese and their sworn rivals in the overseas trade. The Portuguese found the men in Kerala poorly dressed and the women ugly, but most important was that they wore, quote, many bracelets and jewels set with stones on their hands and feet. The Zamorin, as was customary, welcomed the new strangers in a grand darbar, and he provided them with all the usual facilities for traders in Calicut. This alarmed the powerful Muslim traders, who feared that once the Portuguese got a footing in Calicut, they would extend their activities to all the other ports and thus might ruin the Muslim traders. They therefore sought by every means in their power to prejudice the Zamorin against the newcomers. One objection which they urged before the Zamorin's officers proved to be prophetic. The Portuguese, they argued, had not, as the Gama pleaded, undertaken this long and tedious journey from their distant home for mere purposes of trade, of which, being a wealthy nation, they had no need. They had come to spy out the country with the view of returning and then conquering it by force of arms and then plundering it. The machinations of these Muslim traders, aided by large bribes to the officials, brought about an estrangement between the Portuguese and the Zamorin, and the high-handed actions of the former almost precipitated a crisis, aside from which he was enraged too that the Portuguese, while saying they were representatives of a mighty and rich king, had merely brought him some worthless trinkets as gifts. In a fit of anger, the Zamorin ordered that the goods in the Portuguese factory should be seized, and Vasco da Gama, together with his companions, who were already prisoners, should be killed. However, the chief priest and other officers induced the king to rescind these orders and brought about a reconciliation between him and the Portuguese. When Vasco da Gama left the Indian shore on 29 August 1498, He had collected valuable information regarding trade and the routes to India, and he had established seemingly friendly relations with the ruler and the Hindu population of Calicut. Though the goods that the Gama brought back to Lisbon were rated as of little value, and of not much quantity too, the king still appreciated the great value of Da Gama's accomplishment, and he was ennobled. King Manuel meanwhile henceforth styled himself King of Portugal and of the Algarve, Lord of Guinea and of the conquest, navigation and commerce of India, Persia and Ethiopia. This successful venture induced King Manuel to send a larger fleet of 13 vessels on the Pedro Alvarez Cabral on 9 March 1500. Cabral discovered modern Brazil and Madagascar on the way and reached Calicut with only 6 vessels on 13 September 1500. The Zamorin cordially welcomed him, and a treaty of peace and friendship was concluded between the two. Thereupon the Portuguese established a factory at Calicut, but the Muslim traders impeded his trade in spices in every way. Cabral complained to the Zamorin, and in order to hasten his decision, he attacked and seized a Muslim vessel that was loading in the harbour. Those acts infuriated the Muslim traders in turn, who attacked the Portuguese factory and killed Irish Correa, the factor in charge, with 53 of his men, and destroyed the whole building. In retaliation, Cabral destroyed 10 Muslim vessels and bombarded the town of Calicut for 2 days. He then set sail and reached Kochi, whose king's strained relations with the Zamorin have been described before, and who was seeking to rid himself of his vassalage to Calicut. Be it added that Cochin is a far superior port, offering shelter for sailing ships in the stormy season in its broad bay, than the open roads of Calicut is. Cabral signed a treaty of friendship with the Raja of Cochin, promising to conquer the Zamorin's kingdom for him and established a factory there. Here too the Muslim traders were actively hostile, but the Raja still helped the Portuguese in every way, even by placing a guard over the factory building and allowing the Portuguese to sleep within the walls of his palace. When the fleet sent by the Zamorin to chastise the Portuguese was sighted near Cochin harbour in January 1501, the Raja of Cochin warned them of the danger and offered assistance. The fleet of the Zamorin sailed away, however. While still at Cochin, Cabral received overtures to cooperation from the Rajas of Kannur and Kailan too. On his return journey, Cabral visited Kannur and received on board an ambassador from the Raja to the King of Portugal with presents and with the offer of free trade in that kingdom. Thus the two great feudatories of the Zamorin now both sought to recover their independence with the aid of the Portuguese. Eventually, Cabral reached Portugal with 5 vessels so richly laden that the expenses of the whole expedition were easily covered by it. But the most important result of this in some ways disastrous journey was the discovery of the Cochin harbour and the further knowledge of Indian politics, which taught the Portuguese that in the Raja of Cochin, the enemy of the Zamorins, they might find a reliable ally. They realized too that the possibilities of trade were vast, and that the rival they had to fear above all were the Arab traders. It would make no difference to the Hindus whether they traded with Arabs or with Portuguese, though, as far as imports were concerned, the Portuguese were able to introduce and to offer many commodities which were not brought by the Arabs from the Red Sea. The priority of the Portuguese would be to conciliate the local Indian rulers and drive away the Arab merchants. Although the Zamorin was an avowed friend to the latter, to whom Calicut owed its prosperity after all, the Portuguese had the great advantage of beginning their Indian enterprise at Hindu port, and not until they moved further north along the west coast of India did they find themselves in conflict with a Muslim state, Gujarat and Bijapur, whose sympathy with the Arabs was founded on something more binding than mere trade relations. The object of the Portuguese now became not only to hinder as far as possible the trade between India and the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, but also to divert to Portugal all the trade of the East with Europe. To this end, a fleet of 20 ships was dispatched in February 1502 on the Vasco de Gama, followed in April by 5 more vessels under Estefan de Gama. After halting at Kannur for a few days and renewing friendship with its king, Da Gama proceeded to Calicut. The reputation of the Portuguese as a fighting power had meanwhile risen so high that all the Indian and Arab ships had fled that harbour, and the Zamorin, fearful of their vengeance, sent a Brahmin as an envoy with a conciliatory proposal. He delivered up 12 Muslims who were guilty of outrages against the Portuguese during their last visit to the city too, and a large amount was recovered as fines for plundering the Portuguese factory. However, Da Gama was not satisfied, and he made the expulsion of all the Muslims out of the country a preliminary condition to signing any peace. When this was refused, Da Gama bombarded the city for an entire day, killing scores of people and causing great damage to Calicut. If there had been any prospect of peaceful trading in India at all, then Vasco da Gama had now ruined it by this action. Some advisers of King Manuel had warned beforehand that they were likely to meet determined opposition from the Muslim traders and from a Muslim population that was many times more numerous than in Morocco, where the Portuguese merely tenaciously clung to some embattled strongholds on the coast. The Portuguese, therefore, they counselled, should seek the road of peaceful trade, and most modern historians completely agree with them. I doubt, however, whether peaceful trade was ever a realistic prospect, given that the Portuguese insertion in the Arabian Sea trade was always likely to meet with violent opposition from the Mamluk sultans and from their Venetian backers, whatever line the Portuguese would have pursued. Vasco da Gama next established a factory at Kochi and erected a defensive palisade at Kannur. He then returned to Portugal, leaving Vicente Sodré with 6 vessels and a caravel to patrol the coast. The Portuguese could not save Cochin from the revenge of the Zamorin though, who overran the country and forced the Raja and his Portuguese friends to take refuge on Balkati Island in the Bay of Cochin. But in 1503, 3 Portuguese squadrons arrived in Cochin, one of them commanded by Affonso de Albuquerque, who had fought in Morocco before and was at 58 years, in 16th century terms, an old man. The troops of the Zamorin were driven away by the joint Cochin and Portuguese forces. On the arrival of Affonso, the rest of the Cochin territory was cleared of the Zamorin's men, and a treaty of peace was concluded between the 2 Hindu princes, by which the Zamorin agreed to deliver upward of 40,000 pounds of pepper to the Portuguese. In return for their assistance, the Portuguese were permitted to build at Cochin their first fortress in India. This fortress would in the late 16th century grow into a middle-sized European town with its own municipal council and the city rights that were derived from the privileges of the town of Évora in Portugal, and which ported about 40,000 inhabitants, a good 1,000 of them Portuguese, and 6,000 mestizos of mixed Portuguese-Indian blood. It conducted an extensive trade with East Africa, with Bengal, and with the Portuguese settlement of Macau in China. With the late delivery of the second consignment of pepper, hostilities again broke out between Calicut and Cochin, the Portuguese interpreting it as a break of promise. Nevertheless, on the last day of January 1504, two of the Albuquerques, Alfonso and his friend Francesco, each in command of a squadron, left for home. But Francesco disappeared somewhere on the voyage, and Alfonso reached Portugal with only 2 vessels. Captain Duarte Pacheco had been left with less than 100 men to defend Cochin against the entire force of the submarine, which numbered some 60,000 men. Only about 8,000 Cochin troops could be relied on to fight besides the Portuguese. Their first assault was made on Palm Sunday, 31 March, and the siege dragged on for nearly 4 months, during which Pacheco showed himself master of every situation, while the Zamorins forces were daily reduced by gunfire and sickness. Lisbon had of course no news of what was passing in India, and only towards the end of 1504 did Lobo Suarez arrive in Indian waters with a fleet of 14 vessels, with orders to prevent any but Portuguese ships landing and lading at Cochin. At the request of the Zamorin, he visited Calicut, arranged a ceasefire, and then, having taken in cargo, he sailed for home, carrying with him Duarte Pacheco, and leaving in his place a man who did everything to make the Raja regret the departure of that brave soldier. The Portuguese king had meanwhile settled on a new policy. Instead of sending annual expeditions and leaving a small garrison behind to protect the factories, he had decided to appoint a permanent viceroy who would reside in India for 3 years. At the beginning of 1505, Francisco de Almeida was thus sent out in command of a large fleet and 1,500 soldiers, with orders of the king to build fortresses at Kilwa, Mombasa, Anjadiva, Kannur and Cochin, then to proceed to the Red Sea to build a fortress there, because from there we could see no spies passes into the land of the Sultan of Egypt, as the king instructed him, and a year later he was ordered to capture and fortify Ceylon and Malacca. Almeida reached India in September 1505, and at once he began to build a fortress at Anjadiva, an island immediately to the south of Goa, which proved useless and was dismantled 2 years on. He next proceeded southwards to Kannur and later on to Cochin, where he arrived in time to settle in the Portuguese interest a question of succession to the throne. There had been several clashes with Muslim trading vessels which carried no guns and were of the most fragile build, in which the Portuguese with their floating castles were uniformly successful. Now that the Portuguese fleet was patrolling the Malabar coast, it became imperative for the Red Sea merchantmen to adopt a new route by way of the Maldives. Almeida sent his son Lorenzo to patrol this route and to explore Ceylon, but nothing was achieved beyond a quick, hasty visit to that island. The Zamorin of Calicut, alarmed at the growing power of the Portuguese in Indian waters, now made a determined effort to drive them away. In March 1506, an engagement took place between a large fleet of Muslim traders, armed and equipped by the Zamorin, and the Portuguese fleet of 4 vessels, resulting in the capture of the largest Muslim ships and a veritable massacre of their crews, with no casualties among the Portuguese. Later, owing to the unwarranted sinking of a Muslim vessel belonging to the Muslim ruler of the Bazaar of Kanu, the Asi Raja, the ruler of that place, aided by the Zamorin, besieged the Portuguese garrison, who, after great sufferings from shortage of food, were at the end of 4 months saved by the arrival of Tristan da Cunha's squadron, August 1507. Till then, the most northerly point touched by the Portuguese vessels had been Ansigiva, and not till 1508 did they venture nearer to that Konkan coast that ultimately became and was to remain the center of their activities for the next 400 years. But with it began their struggle with the Muslim powers too, for so far, though they had encountered Muslim merchants and their fleets, their political dealings had been only with Hindu rulers. With the Portuguese starting to ship pepper via the Cape, the rulers of Mecca and the Fatimid dynasty of Egypt were being deprived of the duties levied on Indian goods passing through the Red Sea and across Egypt on their way to Alexandria. Venice had meanwhile sent an envoy to Cairo, urging the Mamluks to drop the tariffs on pepper to allow them to compete with the Portuguese, and to seek rapid and secret remedies to the Portuguese present. Sufficiently vague phrases in order not to be accused of plotting the downfall of a Catholic power together with a Muslim one. And the great Muslim kingdoms of Gujarat and Bijapur had also begun to realize that the Portuguese might attempt to do at the northern seaports what they had so successfully achieved at the southern ones. Particularly in the recent Adil Shahi conquest of Goa, that they, as noted in episode 8, raided the pearl of their possessions. The news that the Portuguese had decided to appoint a resident viceroy and to keep a standing fleet in Indian waters impelled these Muslim rulers to negotiate with the Sultan of Egypt too for joint action against the Portuguese. Even the Zamorin is said to have thought of inviting the help of Sultan. So prompt was his response that his fleet, especially equipped at Suez, was ready in May, and it reached Aden in August 1507 under the command of Emir Hussein. Lorenzo de Almeida, the gallant son of the viceroy, set out to the north in April 1508 and was anchored off Chau when this Egyptian fleet arrived off that harbour. And in this, their first naval battle with Muslims, who had clearly had experience fighting Christian foes in the Mediterranean for centuries, they met with a severe reverse, and their young commander was killed. That was in January 1508. Almeida then set sail to avenge the death of his son. He met the Muslim fleet of Dio and gained a signal victory in February 1509, slaughtering these Egyptian forces, largely consisting of galleys, by salvos from the big guns of his big round ships, and followed up by a confused melee of grappling and boarding in the narrow harbour of Dio itself, in which the whole harbour was reputedly tinged crimson. The Portuguese lost 100 men, but the Muslims lost thousands and dozens of ships. On Almeida's return to Cochin in March, a quarrel arose about his delivering the government to Albuquerque, and it was not until 5 November 1509 that this was finally arranged. Affonso de Albuquerque succeeded Almeida under the lower title of Governor of India. Earlier in that year, the Portuguese had made an unsuccessful attack on Calicut. One of the first acts of Albuquerque was to carry out the specific instruction of the King of Portugal to destroy Calicut. For, said he, nothing he would undertake would give him greater pleasure than the destruction of that town. Albuquerque's expedition arrived on January 3, 1510. The Zamorin himself was absent, as had already been ascertained by spies working for the Raja of Kochi, and the town, which contained but few troops, was sacked by the Portuguese. But then a furious crowd of people drove away the Portuguese, who had to fall back. Albuquerque himself received 2 wounds, and a number of high officers were killed. As soon as he had recovered, however, he set to work to refit the fleet, and determined to set out for the Red Sea in search of the squadron of the Sultans of Egypt. On 10 February 1510 he sailed from Cochin with 23 ships for Cape Cardafui, but he was diverted from his course by learning of the defenceless state of Goa, of which he anchored on 28 February. Only a light resistance was offered, and on 4 March he received the keys of the fortress. For, said Albuquerque, quote, Goa was the main centre of the league which sought to cast us out of India, and if the armada which the Turks had prepared in the river of Goa, with plenty of men, artillery and arms for the undertaking, would have sailed, and if the fleet of the Rumis, that is the Egyptians, would have joined them at that juncture, everything would have been lost. End quote. His first aim now became to strengthen the fortifications of Goa in case Yusuf Adil Khan, the ruler of Bijapur, should attempt to recover the place. Albuquerque had already contemplated making Goa the headquarter of the Portuguese in India. But in spite of all his preparations and in spite of individual attention to every detail of defense, he was unable to resist Yusuf Adil Khan's attack, and after many misadventures he had at last to retire to Anzediva on 16 August, much to the relief of his captains, who had all along been opposed to this Goa adventure. During the next 2 months he received important reinforcements in ships and men, and at the end of November he could sail back to Goa and recovered the place by storm. In reporting this victory to King Manuel, Albuquerque wrote, quote, the capture of Goa worked more in your Majesty's favour than 15 years' worth of armadas sent to India. Both the Sultan of Gujarat and the Zamorin now sent him envoys to work out an arrangement, and Amir Hussain, who since his defeat in February 1509 had been at Cambay awaiting reinforcements from Suez, had meanwhile sailed back to find his new fleet still in the process of building. Albuquerque now devoted his energies to the strengthening of Goa and to increasing its commercial importance. He dispatched several captains along the coast with orders to compel all the ships they met to put into that port. From now on, every ship sailing on the Indian west coast was to carry a Portuguese passport, a cartaz, allowing it to sail along that route, and they had to pull into a Portuguese port, Diu Chau Goa or Cochin, to receive a passport, so that eventually much of the trade of the Indian west coast was diverted to the Portuguese ports. For although the Portuguese later on had some incomes from land in Goa, and later on in Ceylon and in Bassein, the revenue of which eventually became their main revenue in India, in the 16th century the bulk of their revenue was derived from the taxation of trade. In Goa every encouragement was given to traders, and vessels soon began to arrive there from Hormuz and elsewhere. In April 1511, Albuquerque set out for Malacca, the entrepot of all traffic between India and China. The first attack on Malacca, on 25 July 1511, led to no definite result, and Albuquerque's captains were against making a further attempt. He, however, finally convinced them of the wisdom of his policy by pointing out that if they were only to take Malacca out of the hands of the Muslims, Cairo and Mecca would be entirely ruined, and Venice would then be able to obtain no spices except what her merchants might buy in Portugal. In August 1511, a second and this time successful attack was made, and the Portuguese now became absolute masters over Malacca. King Manuel wrote to inform Pope Leo X of the event, and the Pope made the news the occasion of a series of ceremonies of public thanksgiving of unusual pomp and splendor. Tristan da Cunha was sent to Rome on a special mission, bearing magnificent presents to the pontiff, including an elephant which, as it passed the papal palace, stopped and kneeled down and bowed thrice to the Pope, who was watching the procession from a window. Albuquerque returned to Cochin in January 1512. Meanwhile, Goa had been besieged by a force of about 40,000 men under the Bijapuri general Ras Al Khan, who had taken up a strongly fortified position at Benastarim on the opposite side of the channel leading to the island of Goa. These fortresses inhibited ships from mooring there. In a furious firefight, taking 8 days, Albuquerque's heavy guns destroyed the walls of the fortress of Benastarim, and he then accepted the ceasefire Ras Al Khan offered him, rather than that he would waste his men in pointless man-to-man fighting. The fall and the successful defense of Goa and the capture of Malacca made a profound impression on the Indian rulers. The Sultan of Gujarat released his Portuguese prisoners, and he sent an embassy to Albuquerque to conclude a treaty of peace by offering due to the Portuguese for erecting a fort. The Zamorin also made friendly overtures, offering a site within his kingdom for the construction of a Portuguese factory. That was established in 1511, but abandoned again in 1525. In 1513, Albuquerque came into diplomatic contact with Persia. Shah Ismail Safavi had sent ambassadors to the kings of Gujarat, Hormuz and Bijapur, and the ambassador sent to Bijapur visited Albuquerque at Kannur and invited him to send an envoy, Miguel Ferreira, to Ismail. Ferreira returned with the Persian ambassador via Hormuz, and at Tabriz he had many interviews with the Shah, who expressed a great desire for the destruction of the Ottoman Sultan, and Ferreira reported the house of Mecca, that is the Kaaba. When he dismissed Ferreira, he sent with him an ambassador to Albuquerque with rich presents. While they were at Hormuz on the return journey, Albuquerque himself arrived there with the fleet. But instead of delivering the city up to the Persians, he cowered Sultan Saifuddin of Hormuz to allow the Portuguese to build a fortress there, by which he established the Portuguese sovereignty over Hormuz, thus denying Shah Ismail's claims. The Persians were not to forget this, and would eventually take their revenge. But in the 16th century they were too preoccupied with the Ottoman threat in the Gulf, and needed the Portuguese as a maritime ally against the Turks in the Persian Gulf. However, Hormuz was an unhealthy place, and in November 1515 Albuquerque got very sick, and feeling his end was near, he set sail for India, having just learned that Lobo Suarez had been appointed Captain Major in India and that he himself had been recalled. The last letter he addressed to King Manuel, dated at sea 6 December 1515, must be quoted here. Quote, "This letter to your Majesty is not written by my hand, as when I wrote I was troubled with hiccups, which is a sign of approaching death. I have here a son to whom I bequeath the little I possess. Events in India will speak for themselves for me. I leave the chief place in India in your Majesty's power. The only thing left to be done now is the closing of the gates of the Straits of Suez. I beg your Majesty to remember all I have done for India, and to make my son great for my sake." End quote. He died on 16 December 1515. 4 governors succeeded Affonso de Albuquerque, the last of whom, Vasco de Gama, was now 64 years old and reached India in September and died in December 1524. During the next years there were 3 governors, the last of whom, Núñez de Cunha, reached India in November 1529. One of his first acts was to transfer the headquarters of the government from Kochi to Goa. This scheme had been originally proposed and been highly favoured by Affonso de Albuquerque, but it was strongly opposed by a large section of Portuguese officials in India. They had sent a strong remonstrance to the King of Portugal against it, and even suggested the rendition of Goa to the Sultan of Bijapur in order to gain his friendship and cooperation. Albuquerque had then sent a long reply answering all the arguments of his hostile critics. On the receipt of this letter, King Manuel decided to retain Goa, and 15 years after the death of Albuquerque it became the permanent Portuguese capital in India. The next 8 years were mainly occupied with the dealings of the Portuguese with Sultan Bahadur of Gujarat and the acquisition of Diu. In the year 1526, as we shall see in a later episode, the Emperor Babar had made himself master of Hindustan from the Indus to the borders of Bengal. His son and successor Humayun endeavoured to complete his father's work, and one of his first undertakings was an invasion of Gujarat and Malabar. Bahadur had made an appeal to the Portuguese for help and had agreed to give them a footing at Diu in return for a contingent of 500 Portuguese. He had already, in 1534, made considerable concessions, ceding Bassein with all its dependencies, including Bombay and Salsette Islands, and all its revenue to the Portuguese. When at last, in 1537, Humayun suddenly withdrew, Bahadur, feeling that his troubles were over, regretted his promises, and he set about negotiating with Núñez de Cunha for his withdrawal from Diu. Long discussions took place with a view to a conference between Bahadur and Núñez de Cunha, who had come up to settle the matter. Eventually, Bahadur consented to visit Núñez on board of his flagship, but on the sloop fetching him to the flagship, a scuffle arose between his party and the Portuguese party, and Bahadur was drowned endeavouring to escape. Early in Bahadur's disastrous campaign with Humayun, the king of Gujarat had made plans for escaping from India with his belongings in the event of defeat. He had dispatched the Sultan Asaf Khan to Mecca with his harem and treasure, and with rich presents for Sultan Suleiman. The Ottoman sultans, since 1517, had been in possession of Egypt. The envoy had an audience with Sultan Suleiman at Edirne, Adrianople, after the death of Bahadur, and by way of avenging the death of the Muslim king, the Sultan at once gave orders for the equipment of a powerful fleet in Suez to attack the Portuguese at Deal. Among the small party that had accompanied Bahadur in his fatal visit to the Portuguese governor had been a certain Khwaja Safar Salmani, who played a key role in subsequent events. He had first been on friendly terms with the Portuguese, who had put him in charge of Deal. But when he heard of the arrival of the Egyptian fleet under Suleiman Pasha, he at once changed his tactics and attacked them. He reported to the Pasha that there were 500 fighting men in Deal and that all he required was guns and munitions. The siege of Deal began in October and came suddenly to an end on 5 November 1538, when the Pasha, hearing of the arrival of 20 Portuguese ships, sailed away without striking another blow. The defense of Deal by a tiny garrison, commanded by Antonio de Silveira, is one of the most heroic episodes in Portuguese history. The brunt of the first attack fell on Cogala, a suburb of the island known to the Portuguese as Vila dos Rumis, and to the Muslims as Bandar i Turk, which with its garrison of about 80 men had at last to capitulate. The main fort of Deal, however, continued to hold out, women and children working with the same devotion as the men. The besieged were also much favoured by the great differences which arose between the Turks and the Gujarati. In the meantime, September 1538, Garcia de Noronha, nephew of Albuquerque, had reached Goa as viceroy, superseding Núñez da Cunha, who had only held the rank of a governor, and who died broken-hearted on the voyage home. In the fleet of 11 ships which brought the new viceroy to Goa was also sailing the first bishop of Goa, which had been made a bishopric by a bull of Pope Paul III in 1534. Garcia de Noronha, on his arrival in Goa, had collected a powerful fleet and army for the relief of Deal, but seemed in no haste to lead them into action, so that when news came of the departure of Suleiman Pasha, his people were furious with the delay, which had deprived them of an opportunity of engaging the Turkish fleet. The viceroy eventually reached Deal in January 1539, and his first task was to rebuild the fort. He next entered into negotiations with the new Sultan of Gujarat, with whom a peace was signed in March of that year. Under its terms, a high wall was to be raised between the fortress and the town, and 1/3 of the custom house receipts were to be paid to the Portuguese. There were continued disputes with the King of Gujarat, however, and finally the Portuguese pulled down the wall between their fortress and the town. In April 1546, Sultan Mahmud III, nephew of the Sultan Bahadur, began to besiege the fortress of Deal, which was commanded by João Mascarenhas. Although he must have regarded this attack as inevitable, no preparations for a siege had been made, and the garrison numbered only 200 men. In command of the besieging force was Khwaja Safar Salmani, who had about 10,000 fighting men under him. On 18 May, reinforcements reached the Portuguese from Goa, raising the garrison to about 400 men, but the Portuguese still remained inferior in artillery and musketry. In June, Khwaja Safar had his head carried off by a cannonball, and he was succeeded by his son Ramzan Rumi Khan. At last in October, João de Castro was able to send sufficient troops to relieve the garrison, which by that time had been reduced to a mere handful of wounded, sick and hungry men. In November the viceroy himself arrived at Deal and led an attack in which 3,000 of the enemy, including Ramazan or Rumi Khan, were killed and 600 taken prisoner. In the middle of the 16th century, when the Portuguese Empire in the east had attained the climax of its grandeur, it was divided into three sections: Cape Cardafui to Ceylon, Pegu to China, and the territories on the east coast of Africa. Under the Viceroy or Governor of India, with his headquarters at Goa, were placed the 5 governors or captains who ruled respectively over Mozambique, Hormuz, Muscat, Ceylon and Malacca. The Viceroy or Governor had the entire control over the military, naval and civil administration. In civil suits, his decision was final, and in criminal matters, his power extended to sentence of death, except in the case of Portuguese noblemen. He was assisted by 2 councils, the Council of State and the Council of the Three Estates. The French traveller François Pyrard de Laval wrote about Goa around 1600 that it had become, quote, the landing place and halting place of all the Indies. Wonderfully peopled, as well with Portuguese, who are the masters here, as with mestizos, Indian Christians and a great variety of infidels, Muslims or Gentiles from Cambay, carrying on great trade or business, many of the richest of them possessing 10,000 crowns or more. These are the men who run all the revenues and hold all the monopolies, from the king as from private persons, and nothing can be sold without the consent of those tax farmers. These classes of people have streets for themselves where they keep shops, for the Portuguese there engage in no mechanical trade whatsoever, but they all call themselves gentlemen, or fidalgos, and live like gentlemen, except that they traffic in gross and in detail, and they too have the right to possess arms, which is not permitted to any Indian. When they proceed about the streets, they are followed by pages on foot, by lackeys and by slaves in great number, bearing arms and dressed in their liveries." For the Indian land powers, the presence of this new European sea power in the Indian Ocean remained politically and largely economically insignificant. The Portuguese intervention in the affairs of Indian rulers was of only marginal importance. The case of the Sultan of Gujarat was an isolated incident. As traders, the Portuguese were generally well received by the Indian rulers, who granted them the same rights as they did other merchants. However, they disliked their attempts to seize all trade for themselves. Therefore, the appearance of European competitors in the ports of the Indian Ocean was welcomed, because these newcomers could be played off against the Portuguese. The potential of the Europeans for intervention in the affairs of the land powers was underrated for 2 centuries. A century of experience of the Portuguese, who were only formidable at sea, seemed to have shown that the Europeans would stick to their own element, the sea, and were not able or willing to exercise any force on land. Actually, a military expedition into the interior of the country was in any case highly unlikely, because the monsoon brought the ships to the Indian shores only during a few months of the year, and thus the supply lines of Europe would be cut off by nature itself. Indeed, it was only later, as we shall see in the last 2 episodes, when the Europeans had established fixed territorial bases and trained Indian mercenaries, whom they paid with money brought to India by their ships, that their potential for intervention increased by leaps and bounds. But that was not to be in the 16th century.